All right, thanks, Pop. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Brad Greenwood. I'm at George Mason University. This is a paper with Jeremy Watson at the University of Minnesota and Gord Birch at BU. So if the building burns down, this slide is all you need to know. So we're going to look at gunshot detection technologies and how they impact a variety of policing outcomes, citizen stops, arrests, complaints lodged against officers, level of crime. There's kind of this natural tension that exists in this relationship, in that like GDPs or GDTs have been aggressively criticized for enabling over-policing, for policing communities of color, but there's not a lot of really good evidence to support that assertion beyond kind of distributional arguments about where they've been deployed. So there's not a lot of great causal stats. So the empirical strategy that we're going to use is a phase DIT of spot shotter specifically and its deployment across Chicago police districts. What we find, interestingly, in my opinion, is that contrary to claims, GDP deployment significantly reduces the volume of citizen stops, both in general and among racial subgroups. We find no systemic correlation with crime levels, but we do see an increase in the likelihood of arrests being made conditional on a crime occurring. And we also find that GDT deployment leads to a systemic rise in citizen complaints against officers, specifically for improper search. So the takeaway, collectively, there's this sort of nuanced dynamic in that the GDTs appear to drive reductions in the extent of policing, but they might lead to a rise in the intensity of policing overall. All right, so what are GDTs? We don't have Gen AI in this model. We have an LLM, a local listening model, so it's a different type of LLM. What a GDT is, what SpotShotter and these other companies do is they have a series of microphones and sensors that they place throughout the city, and it listens for gunshots. Right? And when a firearm is discharged, it attempts to triangulate based on the various different microphones where that gunshot was likely to occur. And then if a shot is detected, it informs local law enforcement, and law enforcement then proceeds with investigatory activities, so search, recovery, and so on and so forth. And they've become something of a lightning rod, right? So you have the MacArthur Center saying that SpotShotter is being deployed overwhelmingly in Black and Latino neighborhoods in Chicago as a pretextual basis for aggressive search. SpotShotter detects system, a lot of people are saying it's ineffective. There's evidence that there's claims from the ACLU that it's being used to over-police Black and brown communities. Vice had a report, which has subsequently been retracted, that the police were telling SpotShotter to say, this is where a gunshot went off, and we'll just figure it out from there. This story has since been pulled. And all of this kind of culminated in a 4th and 14th Amendment suit in the Northern District of Illinois saying that you were violating the constitutional rights of citizens, which is obviously quite alarming. And eventually, the city of Chicago ended its contract with SpotShotter as a result of some of this press. So the concern is that a lot of the empirical evidence is a lot more nuanced than how the popular press is discussing this, which I suppose is not all that surprising when we think about the popular press. The scholarship generally indicates that GDTs affect rates of firearm recovery, maybe hospital admissions, but not a lot of effect on crime itself. The broader issue is that what empirical analyses have been conducted do so absent any statistical means to identify the effect. They're really relying on distributional arguments. They're saying, well, it is here, and that is a community that is more Black or more brown, and they're not being deployed here, which is an area which is more white, relatively speaking, and that obviously raises an omitted variable bias, right? Because those communities, you're more likely to have crime, so there's a prima facie case for deploying it in that area in order to make a detection, right? And if you see evidence, we could actually meet government's burden in trying to demonstrate that this is a relatively low restrictive means to reduce crime in an area. All right, so the question broadly is, what's the effect of GDT deployment on policing outcomes? Like I said, stops, arrests, citizens' complaints, crime levels, and so on and so forth. All right, so I'm an academic, so I have to talk about the related literature. It's a pro forma thing that we have to do. All right, I think GDTs are kind of a continuation of this long stream of literature that we've had in the information field about monitoring technologies and how we can augment worker productivity. All right, and this is really goes back to the IT productivity paradox. And since then, we have a lot of nice literature on how IT can reshape collaboration networks, how it can foster multitasking, how it can substitute for human labor in a lot of cases. But monitoring is this really specific and interesting context because the work studying monitoring really comes to two general conclusions, right, that frequently clash. On the one hand, if we install monitoring systems, which GDT generally is, it's simply monitoring the public, right? It can increase policy adherence, right? So Lamar Pierce has this great paper on employee theft. Right? There's employee performance through digitization, which can be stimulated, and all of these are just very basic principal free riding issues, principal agent free riding issues. All right, on the other hand, there is a good body of work that suggests that modern technologies can actually harm performance because it can undermine trust and relationships, right? It can undermine employee motivations, and I know we're dealing with the public rather than employees in this case, but this idea that you're going to disrupt routines and you can have a deleterious performance potentially on policing is not all that far-fetched, right? And when we come into the world of monitoring and policing, we actually have a lot of attention here, right? But it's frequently based on monitoring individuals, specifically monitoring the police themselves through something like a body-worn camera. And a lot of that literature suggests that we can improve significant outcomes, right, through actually being able to audit police behavior because we have an unbiased log of what's going on, right? GDTs are no exception, right? And a lot of people have looked at first-order effects of GDTs, looked at things like police and evidence protection, emergency response time, gunshot mortality, gunshot reports, and crime deterrence, and they're very nuanced relationships that have been uncovered in that literature. So the concern, and I think what we're trying to bring to bear here, is that not a lot of research has been conducted on how GDTs might alter broader police behavior and their interactions with citizens. Because if we just put on our Econ 101 hats and try and think about the tension, or you think, well, a GDT might reduce the need for broad investigatory activity by enabling officers to respond to specific events, right? So I don't need to have this general level of police presence. I can wait for something to happen and then deploy specifically to there, right? It might also expand the scope of police activity because not every gunshot that happens in the city of Chicago is going to get reported to the police, right? So it might enable more policing because we have more events that we're responding to, and this potentially could be inefficient, right? GDTs might also be used to justify pretextual stops, right? So we say, a firearm was detected in one location. I'm now going to stop every person of color potentially that's in that area, or every person who's not, right? So you might be enabling over-policing in that context, right? It also might reduce racial disparities by creating a veil of darkness, because a firearm is not a racial thing. It's just a firearm discharge. Right? And there is some literature that when we create race blindness in policing, you actually see improvements in outcomes. So we have this kind of mixed bag of prior literature. So let's try and figure it out. Let's set course for adventure and see if we can set some stats here to answer the question. So the data that we're going to use is going to come from the Chicago Police Department. So we have citizen stop data and stop reports, which are aggregated to district month level and split by race, so specifically white and non-white. Crime reports with arrest indicators are going to come from the CPD's public portal, and we're going to specifically parse out firearm-specific arrests, which are discharge offenses and unlawful use of weapons. We have crime closure rates, which are going to be the proportion of crimes that are reported in an area that result in an arrest. And we have citizen complaints against officers, which come from the COPPA office. We also have monthly district staffing headcounts, which we got through FOIA requests. We're specifically worried about staffing because if you deploy it in an area and you subsequently reduce the number of officers there, that could actually have an effect on outcomes as well, right? So we want to make sure that there's stability in staffing. Spot shotter rollout dates are going to come from Connolly et al., and we validate that against the spot shotter alerts data that we have, and they're highly, highly predictive, so it looks like we actually do have a viable schedule, and the count variables, stop, crime, arrest, complaints are all going to be logged, so that's one. All right, so the rollout schedule, blue to green, reflects an earlier to later deployment. These two purple boxes are actually, which straddle things, are actually pilot locations, and the results are robust to their inclusion or exclusion. Or if you just like to see it in kind of a graphical format, right, what you see is a phased introduction over time, phased introduction, DID. So we're going to reguess our various outcomes on the month, vector of month-year fixed effects and a vector of district effects. We're going to be using Susan Athey's matrix completion estimator as well as Gardner's DID2S to deal with all the issues that have popped up regarding phased implementation stuff. And robust standard errors are clustered on the police district. Okay, so what do we see? First, interestingly, at least in my opinion, is that you see a significant stop and drops. So there's at least a prima facie case against this idea that it's enabling over-policing. What you also see is that there's a drop on both white stops and minority stops, and there's no significant difference across those two groups, right? So it doesn't appear that the stops are only happening among white persons or among non-white persons. It's a general decline, which is insignificantly different from each other, right? And also importantly, there's no change in staffing, right? So it's not like the number of officers that are out there is what's actually causing this. Now, obviously, Sonny is super mad because he's like, what about pretreatment trends? You said they're being deployed in high crime areas. This is a flim-flam machine, Greenwood. What are you doing? And Sonny's right, but I see relatively stable pretreatment trends that are coming in and then general declines afterwards. So this tells me that this is a general effect that pops up. All right, and if we just look at staffing, again, this is a noisy zero, but it's still a zero. That's generally a flat line. Now, Milen is mad because I used these same jokes when I was presenting the paper at USC, and it doesn't tell us about the other dynamics. Maybe the crafty criminals are doing less of that crafty crime, which would make sense. There's this detection tool that's out there. I'm going to react to that. I'm going to perform crime in a different location. Well, what we see is there's really no effect on the crime rate, but there is an increase in the crime closure rate, and that tells me that it may be making policing more efficient. Right? And specifically, we have more gun discharge arrests and unlawful use of weapons arrests that happen. Right? So we could be enabling better policing as a result of this. Now, Jing's mad because she's right. I've used these jokes before. Right? I'm recycling, and I don't know if they're arresting the right people. And that's an important caveat to keep in mind. They are making arrests. We do not know if those arrests are leading to proper convictions. We don't know if they're the right people that are being arrested at all. Right? And Jing's right. I did remember to caveat this finding the last time I presented in front of her. But what about the intensive versus extensive margin? Okay. Well, if we think about the intensive margin of what's going on, you do see a rise in complaints after this. Right? There's no rise in weapons complaints, which would be officers drawing a firearm during the stop. But you do see an increase in improper search complaints. Now, that could be, if we're taking kind of a pretextual lens, that could be enabling over-policing against communities that are specifically complaining in the Northern District of Illinois, and they would have a fairly good case. Right? I don't have we do not have sufficiently robust data in the race of the person lodging the complaint to make that. So it's equally possible that, Karens are being stopped, and they're like, how could you possibly stop me? So we don't know where that's coming from. Right? And if you look at the general trends right here, you see that there's an increase in improper search and an increase in trends overall, but no general change. Right? So, this tells me that law enforcement might be using text alerts pretextually once they occur, but again, I don't have sufficiently robust data to make that conclusion. All right, a bunch of robustness checks, and I'm trying to move through these quickly. Dynamic selection is obviously an issue here, so it's worthwhile considering whether or not there's a dynamic selection issue. Right, so if we just part this out and look at lagged crime and whether or not lagged crime predicts deployment in a local area, we don't see any evidence that that's true. Right, a leave one out analysis, maybe one specific location is the one that's driving the entirety of the effect. Well, let's just systematically drop each location that's treated and we'll see if there's some coefficient stability. Once again, we see a lot of coefficient stability across both, so this says, to me, it's a general effect across districts where there is deployment. Right? And finally, traffic stops, which I think is the one that's pretty clever. I think Gord came up with this. The primary outcome is pedestrian stops. Well, if we know that the police are going to stop people in a pedestrian, well, why don't I just move my crafty crime to a car and then I can get away faster, right? Which we would have this displacement effect in how people are being stopped. So if I regress this on traffic stops, what we see is relatively stable pretreatment trends and a drop-off. So there's a decline both in pedestrian stops and traffic stops that's happening. So we don't appear to have this broad substitution. All right, this is just an obligatory picture of Danny's not in the room. But this joke is not recycled, so I wanted to make sure that was called up. So in all seriousness, reports of and concerns about racially biased policing are pervasive, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest they're true. Right? But still, it's critical to evaluate any of these claims fairly rigorously, right? Because 4th and 14th Amendment violations carry very heavy penalties, right? And we do not have infinite resources to solve problems, right? So we should make sure that when we are deploying resources in order to correct these issues, they're allocated efficiently. Right now, I'm not seeing a ton of evidence that this is in fact the case here, although we do potentially have a more aggressive police interaction with citizens after deployment, even if there are fewer interactions overall. right? Like I said, we evaluate the impact of GDT, specifically spot shotter, on various policing outcomes. I think what is really critical to take away is that the welfare implications are at best murky, right? We don't see more stops, but we do see potentially more aggressive stops. And that's the real thing that we should keep in mind. Contributions, I think we're opening up some stuff on the unintended consequences of monitoring technology. I'm running out of time. I think we're also contributing to the literature on GDTs and law enforcement. And I think this has some obvious practical relevance given the number of cities that are actually canceling their contracts with spot shotter. Limitations, there's a bunch of them. We use a quasi-experimental setup, right? We have a measure of crime clearance. We don't know if the right person is being arrested. Omitted variable biases are always out there. I'm a historically very sloppy empiricist. Gord and Jeremy have done their best to stop that from poisoning this experiment, but we should always keep it in mind. But that's what we have. Thank you very much. Xuming. It's not video. This is audio.
Okay. You're going to have the audio. You can get maybe the conversation before the police pulled out the gun, or before and after. You see the escalation, the emotion, the charges over there. Maybe help you explain some of the results.
I mean, we don't have individual body-worn camera data from every one of Chicago Police Department interactions, right? So the GDT is just a general monitoring technology. It detects the discharge of a firearm, and then pinpoints with some accuracy the location where that occurs, and then law enforcement is deployed from there. Right?
Okay.
So that would require like a completely different setup and completely different data.
Right. So we can talk more. There's stats department at the wording here. They have there's the video data on each stop.
Okay.
So that would be overlap with the Chicago Police Department. We can talk more.
Cool. Sir?
Have you considered the difference between the survivals of the victims of the gunshots that were discovered by the first responders?
We have not in this paper. There is some fairly good work that looks at ambulance times, right? So when the GDT is deployed, there is a decrease in the amount of time it takes people to get to the emergency room. And I think, Gord, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you do see an increase in ER admissions as well. And so I think that gives a prima facie case that these things are somewhat functional. And we would expect that, given that you're going to have quicker reporting than a human that potentially runs away and then debates whether or not they should call 911. So I think intuitively it would make sense that relationship would exist. But
I'm from Chicago, so we have a number of issues post undeployment.
Beyond just the pizza, it's too thick.
That's it. Thank you.
Question: on the complaint data, back to CPD, did you correlate the sort of rise in profile of COPA?
The rise,
meaning like in Chicago, the availability or the understanding that COPA existed is something that has been escalating across time as well. Previously reporting to the Chicago police that you had a complaint meant you went to a Chicago police sergeant and explained you had a problem, as opposed to contacting COPA.
It's a fair question. We have a series of time fixed effects, so as long as that's not correlated with the treatment, I don't think it should be an issue. Right? If there's just a general rise over time, that should be soaked up by the fixed effect. But it would be an issue if that is systemically correlated with treatment. So if they're specifically telling people in those communities, but yeah, that's the best I can do. I don't know if that data is available. I'm beginning a sign that says wrap it up.
Wrap it up.
So thank you all very much for your time.